conversations with the SOP that had no consideration.
I call the honourable member Moana Maki.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Now, Part 4 amends the Reserves Act 1977, and this is where we see that synergy that we had with Part 2, where any new land that's deemed to be a reserve will now automatically go into Schedule 4 of the Crown Minerals Act and will therefore be protected. Well, that's the general idea. We have concerns that that may change in the future, given noises that have been coming out of industry where they are going out and actually prospecting in Schedule 4 land. The government says they're just having a look. They're just interested to see what might be out there. Well, my experience is that businesses don't pay money just out of pure curiosity. They're doing it because they've had, obviously, an indication from this national-led government that at some point in the future those parts of Schedule 4 are going to be opened up for exploration. Otherwise, why would they be looking? And it's very, very disappointing because obviously this is an issue that the public are extremely concerned about. When you have tens and tens of thousands of people marching up Queen Street, that sends a very strong message. The government said they'd back down, but all indication is they're doing it on the sly now. So whilst I welcome this amendment in Part 4, which deems that any new land that is added to the Reserves Act 1977 automatically goes into Schedule 4, there doesn't have to be a process that has gone through, that's very good. It's the same thing again, Mr Chair, which is right through this bill. One step forward, 5 steps backwards, and that's a disappointing thing. Yes, that's good. Yes, it's good that Part 4 means that any new reserve land goes straight to Schedule 4. That's fantastic. But what else does Part 4 do? Again, it completely dilutes the role of the Minister of Conservation. And one of the really big concerns has been where we've seen the role of the Minister of Conservation undermined, no pun intended, and replaced by order in council. Did you like that, Mr Heatley? It wasn't bad, was it? Completely undermined, because the role of the Minister of Conservation is to be basically the guardian of the Department of Conservation land for the public of New Zealand. That is their role. They are there to ensure that future generations of New Zealanders will continue to enjoy the beauty, the biodiversity and everything that our conservation estate has to offer. And here we are in Part 4, and, for example, Clause 64 amends Section 5 of the Reserves Act 1977 by removing the ability of the Minister of Conservation to declare state forest land to be a reserve under the Reserves Act. That might not seem like a big deal to a lot of people, but again, this is death by 1,000 cuts to the Minister of Conservation. Here is yet another, and we've had endless examples through every single part of this bill. It's a shame we didn't get a longer debate on Part 1, actually, because we didn't even manage to get to all the powers that are being removed from the Minister of Conservation in Part 1. But here's Part 4. We had it in Part 2. We had it in Part 3. Here's Part 4, a seemingly innocuous part of the bill that does a good thing, which is ensuring all new reserve land goes into Schedule 4, and yet, again, time and time again, taking away the powers of the Minister of Conservation to be able to effectively protect the Department of Conservation estate. So that's Clause 64, that's one example, removal of the power to declare state forest land to be a reserve under the Reserves Act. So we go to Section 6 of the Reserves Act 1977. And this provides the Minister of Conservation with powers in cases where there might be doubt or uncertainty about a reserve. Now, this is a very important role that the Minister of Conservation carries out, because from time to time, and I suspect marine reserves are a classic example in particular, from time to time you're going to get uncertainty or doubts about what was agreed, about where boundaries might lie, about the rules of engagement in terms of how people are able to utilise that reserve land. There are endless reasons why concerns might be raised, or there might be difficulties with determining what actually was agreed to in the case of a reserve. And it's the role of the Minister of Conservation to ensure that in deciding how that is worked out or sorted out amongst the various parties that disagree, that the best interests of the conservation estate and the preservation of the conservation estate is absolutely paramount. So what are we doing in Part 4 of this bill, Mr Chair? Well, what we're doing is we're again inserting through this amendment bill a new act which takes away from the Minister of Conservation and gives the power to the Governor-General to declare that the land is or is not a nature reserve or a scientific reserve. And it says This power overrides the powers of the Minister in Section 6 of the current Reserves Act. So you know what that means? That means that the Government and Cabinet get to make the decision, because the Governor-General's not going to go out there and have a look. I mean, his role is a kind of a formal one. So this is the Government, again, taking away the powers of the Minister of Conservation, who is the particular, Mr Chair? Thank you. Who is the particular Minister who has sole responsibility for that, and giving it over to a Cabinet that, by its very deeds thus far, have shown us that they are not really interested in protecting the conservation. Well, that's right, Stephen Joyce, the Minister of Economic Development, will be making this decision, and it won't be the best interest of the conservation estate and the protection and preservation of the conservation estate for future generations. That will be paramount when the Governor-General is making those decisions about whether to declare that land is or is not a nature reserve, or is not a scientific reserve, and that is not appropriate. Again, diluting away the powers of the Minister of Conservation. But that's not the end of Part 4 and the diluting of powers of the Minister of Conservation, because Clause 67 of this bill makes another change under Section 16 of the Reserves Act. Now, under Section 16 of the Reserves Act, reserves are classified by the Minister of Conservation, but under the new Section 16A in this amendment bill, the Minister will have that ability to, or that power to classify reserves restricted. So they'll be able to classify recreation, historic and scenic reserves, but nature reserves and historic reserves will be done by Order in Council. So again, here we have a role that the Minister of Conservation rightly carries out. It is appropriate that that is the role of the Minister of Conservation. It is the way it has always been. It has worked well, having a minister whose role it is to be the custodian of the Department of Conservation Estate on behalf of current and future generations of New Zealanders. And here again, the National Party is saying, no, Stephen Joyce knows better, so we will give him that power under Order in Council to make decisions which should be being made, and up to this point are currently being made by the Minister of Conservation. But that is not the end of it, Mr Chair. Part 4 also amends Section 47 of the Reserves Act to provide in future that wilderness areas will be set apart by Order in Council, rather than by the Minister of Conservation. So here we have yet another area where Stephen Joyce is going to be determining whether or not wilderness areas are set apart. And again, we have removals of powers that currently sit with the Minister of Conservation. And Part 4 is seemingly not that controversial. But it's been the same with every single part in this bill, which is when you go through it, it's the habit of this national government to take away those areas where it's clear where the decision-making power lies, to remove it from that person, and then to do it through an Order in Council process, which doesn't have to come to this House, which doesn't get to be debated, which doesn't often get the scrutiny, because a lot of the members of the public probably don't even know what the Order in Council process is, how they can object to it, how they can take a complaint against it through the Regulations Review Select Committee, which my colleague Marion Street chairs. And the Minister who's in the chair at the moment was a very active member of that committee. She knows very well and has a great respect for good regulation. So I'm sure she's appalled by putting so much more through these regulatory processes, away from the ability of the public to scrutinise them adequately, away from the ability of the public to be able to make complaints, because, as I said, I think maybe even members in this House aren't sure about how they would take a complaint against a process that was carried out by Order and Council. And even if they can take a complaint to the Regs Review Select Committee, the grounds upon which they can complain are very narrow. So instead of having that broader debate with a minister where the public know this is the person who makes these decisions, this is the person who classifies reserves, this is the person who, if there's any uncertainty, we go to clarify what the position is, now it's being done through this very, very away from the public, difficult to understand, difficult to access, frankly, compared to the minister, this process, because the government doesn't want to have that level of scrutiny, which makes me wonder what they have in plan for the conservation estate. Why are they trying to make it difficult by pushing everything through Order in Council? And under this Reserves Act, this is particularly worrying, because this is where we have the Schedule 4 land. This is the most precious land in the conservation estate. This is where it's classified. What are they planning to do, that they want to make all these processes go through Order in Council rather than openly and transparently through a minister who is then open to judicial review in a way that the Order in Council process is not so much. And I think we know the answer to that. And it's as I've said before, we have minerals companies out there now prospecting in Schedule 4 land. They're not spending money on looking just for curiosity. They're not spending money looking just for the hell of it. They know that they're going to be allowed to mine that land.
Mr Chair.
Zenia Sage.
Thank you, Mr Chair.